All right. Welcome to another installment of our midweek online Bible study. And we have been talking about for the last couple of weeks the role of idols in our lives. Of course, at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, the first commandment said, there's one God, worship Him alone, no other gods before me. And it goes on to talk about creating idols out of things at the beginning. And it was an idol. It was something made out of gold or stone or wood, carved. They call it graven image because an engraver or a graver would make something, and then people would worship that because they could see it. And so we talked about in the Old Testament a little bit, the role of those idols. And then Ezekiel really connecting it to an idolatry that's deeper than something that sits on your mantle, right, in your house that you bow down to. It's really an idolatry of the heart. And so it's really about priorities. It's really about God being first in our lives and nothing else, or God in the sense that there are things that God should give us that we shouldn't rely on other people for, because God is God. That's His role in our lives. That if we look to other people for that, whether it's for worship or for approval or for any number of things, that we really taking God out of the heart that He wants to be in. So it's not God being number one in our lives, whether we become God or whether we've appointed somebody else or let something else play that role. It's really unfortunate. And of course, the Bible talks about that too. We looked at last week in the book of Romans. And Paul puts a theological spin on it. He said, rather than worshiping the creator of everything, we've worshiped the created. Or the creature, or that which is made from God. And that could be ourselves, that could be us as creatures, that could be other things, but looking to that. And the whole thing is that's an odd response when you have the creator of the universe there to turn around and say, well, I'm going to worship something that the creator made as higher than. So we're making that which is made higher than the maker of all things. And of course, that's out of line theologically and in so many different ways. And so the Bible's trying to point us to a place where our hearts are together in line with God being God, us not looking to all the other things. We even talked about the role of Adam and Eve and pride and all of those other things. So you could go back and watch the first two episodes of this video if you have not already. And then we ended last time talking about any number of areas that we could look at. Tim Keller had a list in his book on Romans, things that could get in our way, that could be idols in some way, shape, or form, things like power and approval and control, image, comfort, could be dependence, could be independence. It's not a matter of things that are evil, it's a matter of things that we're not using for their purpose. Control might not be bad if you're controlling something you should have control over, but if you want control over the uncontrollable, that's where the situation has a problem. It could be work, achievement, materialism, belonging. We had a screen up at the end of last time listing all of these, relationship, suffering. There's one, and we're going to talk about it this week, that kind of encompasses several, but in a couple of different stories, we're going to look at the role, perhaps, of family idolatry, turning our family into idols. And we could go to any number of places in the Bible to kind of talk about this issue. But in the book of Genesis, there are two stories that are kind of side by side that are going to bring that out in just a minute. So I was reading some resources about the idea of idolatry, and one of the things they said is start with this question. If God asked me to do blank, I wouldn't do it. If there's an answer to that, what would it be in your life? Because that's, heading into the idolatry range. If God asked me to give up blank, I wouldn't do it. Well, that's also interesting. I would never, ever do blank, even if it was God's will or for God. Those are interesting questions that begin to get us thinking about what we're grabbing a hold of the most. And what the Bible says, we really want to grab a hold of God. We haven't had a loose grip on everything else. And it's kind of with family, it's interesting because I believe firmly that as a father and a husband, God has given me my family for me to love and take care of and cherish and control and all of these things. However, He has not given me my family for them to be my God. He retains that God part. And so while I might see myself in large part as a provider for my family, trying to do the best that I can, ultimately God provides. And so there's a back and forth there that I think is really interesting that we should take time to look at. And we will in the form of two stories, one in chapter 22 of Genesis and the other in chapter 27. In chapter 22 of Genesis, we have what I think is a fairly familiar portion of Scripture for a lot of people. If you are used to, grew up in church and kind of remember the stories of Abraham and Isaac. And one of the issues is when Abraham was coming along, he and his wife did not have a child of any kind, so they would not have heirs, didn't have a son. And so they prayed, and God delivered, and God gave them a son named Isaac. They were both well advanced in years. And so when God gave them this son, and they had the answer to their prayers, and God had also accompanied that with a promise of increasing their heirs by the number of the sea or something. It was an interesting promise. But that God was going to bless their family through the newborn son, and then he's going to do great things through them. Fast forward a few years, and Isaac has grown, and God sets out to, in many ways, you're kind of careful to say this, but test Abraham's faith to see if he is indeed following God first. And so what he says is, Isaac, Abraham, I want you to go and you're going to sacrifice your son for me. Well, that's an interesting idea. And so, that's not something that necessarily is done today, but a sacrifice of an animal would not have been out of line. And some people during that society did take human lives as sacrifices for some reason or another. He would have been familiar with that, and so it wasn't something that he would maybe not have heard of, but the idea of sacrificing the son, number one, would have caused issues because, hey, God, you promised me things through the son. If I sacrifice him, how are you going to do that? If you gave me a child at 90 years old, 100 years old between us, and that was a miracle, surely now at 120, 125, whatever, how many years had gone by, surely that's even more. Do you want to start over in your promise, God? And so Abraham has this idea that God's going to deliver because, again, of his faith in God. And so he says in verse 8 of chapter 22, the fire was there, everything but the sacrifice. And so Isaac says, listen, the fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb we're going to sacrifice? And Abraham knows that he was told to sacrifice his son Isaac. And his response in verse 8 is just, God will provide. So he's a man of great faith. In fact, he's remembered lately as a man of great faith. Even in the New Testament, Abraham, the man of great faith. And so that's an interesting situation. But Abraham goes through that process and is willing to sacrifice Isaac. He binds him up, puts him on the altar, is getting ready to sacrifice him. And God says, no, don't do that. I now know that I'm number one. And because of that, I'm going to bless you. And he says, God tells him, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you've not even withheld your son, your only son, from me. So he knows that he's first in Abraham's eyes. So Abraham looked up, and behold, there was a ram caught in a thicket. So he went out and got that and used it as a burnt sacrifice. And they called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. Abraham's faith named places, right? The Lord will provide. And so after that, he says, your offspring will be as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemy, and in the offspring shall all the nations of earth be blessed, because you've obeyed my voice. It's that obedience and putting God first that our God is one. Okay, we're not to worship everything else as God. Otherwise, there would have been a conflict there. But I think God knew that in the sense that God had given him Isaac for him to protect and carry and provide for, that in some ways God is the ultimate protector and provider. And so whether or not Abraham can't see through to that, God can in a way. And so he has faith in God and he carries through. The whole idea is the priorities are right, and God blessed Abraham greatly. And so if you look at that within one generation, how far this gets skewed. Because in Genesis chapter 27, I can't possibly put all of these verses up on the screen because there's just so many of them, and reading several chapters and going back and forth, it would be kind of confusing and a lot going on in the video. So I'm just reading a few verses. But in chapter 27, we see Isaac getting older. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were twins. One came out a few seconds earlier. The other was grabbing his heel. There was great debate. In chapter 25, it says Isaac loved Esau, but his wife Rebekah loved Jacob. And so there was conflict. In other words, both of them loved their son so much, and they picked a son to love, and they carried out. And one of them was a hunter-gatherer, and he loved that, and the other one wasn't. Okay, so they made their alliances, and they went on. What happened is a form of idolatry. If you go back and read the passage, and I'll show you where it becomes so much interesting. And I've got a slide. I want to show just two verses, and one from chapter 22 and one from chapter 27. And it's the same verse, verse 8, which is awfully convenient for the references. But in the first one, chapter 22, verse 8, is God will provide. That's what Abraham tells Isaac. In the second one, Rebekah is trying to convince Jacob that he deserves more than Esau, because Esau gave up his birthright. There was a whole story about lentil soup or stew or porridge or pottage or whatever you want to call it. He gave up his birthright, that somehow Jacob deserved it more. That's not the way, when a blessing was given in the Old Testament, it's supposed to be to the elder son. So in that way, you think God had set up because Esau came out first, to bless Esau. That's the way Isaac saw it. Rebekah said, no, I got a better idea. Jacob, you should do it. And so she comes up with this scheme. Well, Jacob means schemer and supplanter, and that's exactly what he did, and that's exactly what his mom did. But in the midst of all of the plan to steal from the father his blessing, to connive, to deceive, to lie, all of these kinds of things, Jacob has an issue, and he talks to his mom. And he says, "No, wait a minute. What if I get a curse and not this? And what if I do that, not this?" And so Rebekah tells her son, "Obey my voice as I command you." In spite of his questions about, wait a minute, didn't God set it up a different way? What Rebekah says is, my ways are better than his ways. My thoughts higher than his. Listen to me, obey my thoughts. And so in some way for Jacob, his mom has become his God. She has become her own God. She's the one making the rules, right? But it's all because her first priority is not the way God has set things up, but her first priority is, this is the son I love. I want him to get the best. I want him to get the best. And so they deceive dad. Esau's mad because he doesn't get the blessing that he thinks he should. Jacob is threatening of his life. Isaac decides to make him run away. He leaves for 40 years. The whole story carries on. It's a very messy system there. A good chance that he never saw his mom again. So she did this wonderful thing, she thought, for her son, to bless him so that he would be the one to carry on the blessing of Abraham. This is one generation. Again, this is Isaac, who hadn't learned the lessons. Here's the thing. Abraham learned the faithful lesson, but Isaac was actually on the sacrifice bound up. He was on the altar. What do you think he learned out of that? Well, we know that he still wanted Esau to get it, right? The blessing that would carry on the generations. But how much? Was it enough to straighten things out, or did he kind of, instead of fixing the issue when he could, and possibly it seems like he waited till the last opportunity possible, and he was blind, couldn't recognize his sons. He had put it off and put it off and put it off. There's disunity in his family from the beginning. From the beginning of those two boys, there was disunity, and he didn't fix it. So you couldn't say, well, it's all Rebekah's conniving and not his. Well, no, I think some of the blame belongs to his feet. Certainly, it was two in that situation, the deceiver and the deceived, right? And so we have a difficult situation there. The story turns out decent because Jacob goes on to do many, many good things, but he doesn't see his mom again. There's problems in the family, and so it turns out to be a very messy thing. All because of what? All because the roles of the kids in that family were exaggerated to a place they should not have been. The role of Jacob's mom in his life was exaggerated to a place where it should not have been. When she said, "Obey me," and he knew the command of God, he should not have obeyed her. He should not have gone along with the tricks. And so the bad things happen when you don't have your priorities right, when something gets in the way of God, when you look to one thing to give you what God alone is supposed to give you, or to steal something that God said you shouldn't have. And so idolatry in different ways, and it's kind of hard to put our hands on, because you say, well, is that idolatry of the family? Sure, but is it also power and control? Well, sure. Is it image and dependence and belonging and all the other things, relationships? There's a lot, it's all wrapped up into. If God is God and you obey him, you're going to follow his will. And if he's not, you're going to get in trouble and you're going to go a different way. But it steals from you having the best and fullness of what God has to offer. It's not just about God suffering in some way, shape, or form because you have an idol. It is about you. And if you go back to Paul, you remember the people who were living the unrighteous life, the wrath of God was revealed on them because they were obscuring truth from other people. What God was worried about, and the reason the wrath of God was applied, is that they were deceiving other people and they too could not see God. And so God was being stolen or robbed, the blessings of God, from a lot of different people. It wasn't necessarily about God in that way. It was about us not being able to receive the blessing of God. And that's a difficult place for us to kind of be in that situation. So on one setting, God, will provide. And on the other, Rebecca says, I got this. I'm going to take over and do. And so Jacob was away for a long time because of their mixed up priorities and how they did that. So I do, again, this week have a few study questions at the end of the lesson. So there are going to be a few slides here to ask some pointed questions. I have an idea that this was a much easier thing for me to do on video than to do in the midst of a group of people, because I have in mind that, we love our families well, and we should. But maybe at times we confuse loving them well with elevating them past where they should be. And one of the questions has to do with, is elevating a person to a role they should not play in your life because God's got that role, is that really a generous love at all? And I don't believe it is. I believe loving people in the way that honors them in our lives, respects them, lifts them up, all the ways which we want to love is wonderful. But we can't let people play God in our lives when God is God. It's not good for God, it's not good for us, and it's not good for them. It's not what love is, letting people play a role that they shouldn't play. And so I hope that you're enjoying this so far. Next week, we're going to jump into the New Testament. Jesus talks a lot about idolatry and placing things above himself in that regard. So we're going to look at one of those examples next week. But I wanted to kind of point out, some ways in which even the things that are good for us in our lives, if we distort those, can become bad for us in our lives. So hope you're doing well. Hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you soon. And until then, God bless you.